Hello everybody, and thank you for tuning in to this special report on Turkey. With me today as co-host is Chris Rosini. Chris, welcome to the program.
Great to be with you, Dr. Paul.
Well, good. Turkey certainly is in the news today. It's in the financial news, and it's been in the news off and on for several weeks because it's had a lot of financial problems, and there's a lot of sanctions going on. There's a sanction war. Some people don't want to call it a war, but I call it a war when they start talking and yelling and screaming at each other who's going to put the most tariffs on each other. And right now, we're not on the friendliest basis, with Erdogan in Turkey, and I don't think is good. Turkey's politics is pretty messy right now, and I don't take sides obviously there, but we're too much involved. It looks like it's said that we have never grown so antagonistic to another member of NATO. But Chris, maybe one thing that may come of this mess that's over there, this antagonism, is that this will, diminish any respect for NATO, and another good reason for us to get out of NATO, because they've been a NATO-type ally, for 50 years. Since the 50s, they have been in NATO. But that seems to be changing, and Erdogan, for practical reasons, are aligning themselves with another faction. He's talking to the Russians, and he's getting help from other countries. He's actually talking to Merkel in Germany. And when you think about how we have severed some relationships and making relationships terrible with Iran, you can see why maybe the Europeans might have a reason to go another route and maybe maintain some trade with Iran and collaborate with Turks. But anyway, I see a lot of reasons why we have been involved, and certainly the economics of what the Turks have done has been a reflection of our monetary policy and our foreign policy, and they weren't running a libertarian economic system for sure.
That's correct, and there's a lot of stories, finger pointing, the typical stuff that happens, but this is a classic financial crisis, and financial crises are caused by central banking, the fiat money system. But as usual, like President Erdogan is pointing at Trump's tariffs. Now, Trump's tariffs are bad policy. They're bad for Americans, but that's not what caused the crisis in Turkey. All you have to do is look at the money supply chart and interest rates for Turkey over the last decade or so, and you'll see that this is just a typical credit bubble. Same thing that happened in the United States when they pump money into the system. They're building skyscrapers over in Turkey. They're building all types of stuff, and ultimately all the credit bubbles have to pop, and it looks like we're at that point.
Right, and there are some factions. One of the things we hear about a lot in the media is the demands of return of a couple prisoners, so to speak, and that is, Gulen is in Pennsylvania voluntarily, but the Turks are demanding that he be sent back to Turkey because they believe he participated in that attempted coup 2 years ago. At the same time, the Turks are holding a Protestant U.S. minister by the name of Brunson. And now they said, Turkey said, let's have an exchange. Both sides would like to get those two individuals back. And it isn't because all of a sudden we go any place in the world when we hear that somebody did something wrong to a Christian that we have to make it right. So often our policies have been very detrimental to Christians around the world. But here, this is determined. If you'd have heard Pence, talk about this is an evangelical Christian issue, and it's big, and they're demanding it. But here it turns out that a little bit of information about Brunson. He is a Christian minister, but he's lived in Turkey for 23 years. It's not exactly he's an American missionary that just went over there and got into trouble, and was arrested. But he was arrested and caught up after the attempted coup a couple years ago, and he's been under arrest. And Gulen, of course, left Turkey after he had a break with Erdogan and came to Pennsylvania. So, but the Turkish government believes that it is Gulen that is orchestrating all this. So all this fussing about these two individuals, I think, are either distractions or excuses or whatever to something much bigger. But you know, every time you hear about a coup, you have to be suspicious, not because we're paranoid, but because of the history of this country. You have to think, could our government, could our CIA be involved? And there's been people who make that accusation that Gulen has been, associated, he's been associated with the CIA, and that he did have something to do with that attempted coup. But there's a lot of arguments going back and forth and saying, arguing each their case. And I don't think we can solve that problem, but it's part of this problem that goes on there because there's an escalation there, and there is a consequence going on in Turkey that we should expect in many other places. Because one of the problems is that when we had our QEs, we had a tremendous increase of credit, and the Chinese got a lot of our money because we bought a lot of stuff, and then a lot of these dollar loans were made. So the third world nations borrowed a lot of money in dollars, not their local currencies, because sometimes their local currencies go down. That's exactly what's happening in Turkey right now. The lira is going down rapidly, and they're under the gun, and they have to pay their loans back in dollars. But I think this is just the tip of the iceberg of that type of problem, that there's a lot of bad loans like this. So we're very much involved, and it's not going to be solved by putting on sanctions and arguing and saying, well, yes, if you would just send our Christian minister back. Well, he's back to where? He's lived there for 23 years, but he is an American citizen, so I guess you can argue it. But I don't think a whole lot of people realize that. And the fact that his daughter has been raised there, so she's very Turkish. But I think it's an interesting fact, but I think that the big mess is the economic policy and our foreign policy and our Federal Reserve policy that is coming together, and we're seeing a coming together of an event which was predictable. We just don't know when they're going to burst out or how big they'll be and how they're going to be resolved. But I think the whole world is built on about as much stability as we saw in the economy of Turkey.
Yes, and Turkish and American governments, they're very similar. They just pile one bad decision on top of another. I mean, we've seen President Trump put up tariffs, and now he's bailing out farmers. So Americans are getting hit twice. And in Turkey, the inflation rate I read today, Professor Stephen Hanke said that it's 100% inflation they're having. So people are losing value. Their food is going up, their rents, their fuel. So what does Erdogan do? He's now putting up tariffs, which hurt Turkish citizens, on American products. So they're getting a 1-2 punch. So it's just governments just snowballing bad decisions.
And also, Erdogan put on some currency controls, meaning that he doesn't want the people to take their money out because that sort of weakens their currency. But the immediate reaction was that it gave a little boost to the lira. So, but that's on the short run. On the long run, sanctions don't work, inflation doesn't work, printing money doesn't work, debt doesn't work, and currency controls doesn't work. But they try all these things, and then they look for bailouts, and sometimes they, can patch it up and keep it going. But I think it's a sign that there's a realignment in this area as well, politically speaking, because certainly Turkey has had reason to go back and forth and pick their friends, and they're different than they were 5 years ago or 10 years ago or maybe even a year ago, because I think at one time they were betting on a defeat of Assad and had made their plans. But if you read about what's going on, there's a lot of talk, once again, about oil and where the pipelines are coming and what how Turkey can participate in it, and who will be their allies. And one is Russia. Even though a Russian plane was shot down by the Turks, I think that's sort of past now. It's a couple of years ago. But I think they may well get along when it comes to who's going to participate in the pipelines that go through that region. And you just think of all these years of fighting over a pipeline. They're still fighting over a pipeline in Afghanistan. If they would only think of what can be achieved with peaceful approach. I always use the Vietnam example. Look at what was lost by the French and Americans in Vietnam, promoting Western values. Oh, such a disaster. And then after it was all over and we lose and leave, a bit of capitalism broke out. And that's the way I look at these things. Why don't they try a little bit of freedom once and cooperation? And they both could benefit. It wouldn't be just one side benefit and the other side suffering. But I would suggest to our American leaders that this is an excuse to maybe reassess ourselves of our total involvement in running a world empire with our military threats and also the control of the financial system, because we do control the financial system and we control the reserve currency of the world. And if Turkey is a hint of what can come, because there's so much debt out there, I think it's about $226 trillion worth of global debt, and it won't get paid. It gets liquidated. And when if the dust settles over in Turkey, there will be a lot less debt, but it will be liquidated because they can't pay for that. They can't pay all those bills. Somebody's going to lose out. The big question is will the world planners be able to contain this, that it doesn't spread? But I think that's the stories that we'll have to look for, is see how much this is spreading. Certainly the political situation in that region is not more settled. It's more disruptive than it was before this trade war broke out with Turkey. And certainly our hands aren't clean on that, because that's sort of a favorite little tool that Trump likes to use.
Mm-hmm. And you're 100% correct. There's an empire aspect to this story. That's why we're talking about Turkey, because the West, specifically the United States, wants to keep them in their orbit. And Turkey has been talking to Russia, getting close to Russia, China. They want to be a part of BRICS. They're talking to the Southeast Asian nations. So Erdogan has been pulling away from the Western orbit, and they want to bring him to heel. But, we argue that United States, just as you just said, should not be in the empire business. We should be worried about America and not Turkey. Let Turkey run their own lives, and they don't have to obey our orders.
No, that is right. And in closing, I want to just suggest that the reassessment of our total policy is what needs to be done. Because to me, it's always amazing how long some of these situations last and how long a currency can last, even though it has no value and though it's not a convertible currency, and how the dollar standard, persists. But it won't last forever, because the debt is too great, and the determination on our side to police the world and to be the dominant economic factor, and that we won't let anybody get away with anything, and that if they push back, then we just push harder. That's not a very good way for the world to operate. And it's all over power and money and personalities as well. But there is a much better way. And the whole thing is, as I mentioned, there's a lot of delay in developing and having resources developed in a voluntary fashion compared to what's going on now, where everybody has to demand control and fight over it. But I think geography has a part to play in it. If it's in your backyard, if there was some type of an economic, political crisis in Mexico, we're more justified to be dealing with that. But we're less justified to persist and expand and be involved in all these coups and that go on. And the American people know that. I think in the last 10 years, we were involved in 5 major coups around the world. And yet, what do we all hear? What does the news say? Oh, yeah, there was collusion between the Russians and the Trump campaign, which they never proved, but we go on and on. We get involved in these coups and these involvements, and we've been involved in this Turkish politics. So I think we need to keep an eye on what's going to happen and keep emphasizing the importance of a non-interventionist foreign policy, and look to ourselves and look to a sort of sound currency someday, because that would help prevent some of these problems from developing. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to this special report, and please come back soon.